Hi, everyone. My name is Haley Wilding, and I'm a student at BYU Idaho University. Yeah. Um, and my presentation is on the preservation of the Burgess Shale fauna. Just to start off my presentation, I like to start with a quote by Simon C. Morris, and he said, "The Burgess Shale is not unique, but for those who study evolution and fossils, it has become something of an icon. It provides a reference point and a benchmark, a point of common discussion, and an issue of universal scientific interests." So the Burgess Shale is set apart from other fossil-bearing rock bodies because the fossils that are preserved therein are soft-bodied organisms, and we'll get more into why this is so unique and why it sets it apart from the other parts of the world. So first, we're going to focus on the discovery and who discovered it. So Charles D. Walcott, he was a geologist for the Smithsonian Institute, and they sent him on a fossil finding journey up to the Canadian Rockies, where he was in 1909, and he was looking for fossils, and he found a perfectly preserved fossil that was a soft-bodied organism, so like this one up here in this corner right here, and he realized that he had stumbled upon something great, and so for many years after that, he would go back and he would study the fossils and the faunas that were found in the Burgess Shale. As you can see in the bigger picture down on the bottom of the screen, that was him and some of his colleagues a couple years later. So where did the Burgess Shale come from? So it started to form on the Cambrian Earth. So the Cambrian time period was approximately 500 million years ago. And you can see it looks very different than the world we know today. The largest continent was called Gondwana land, and other continents were China, Siberia, Kazakhstania, and Baltica, and Laurentia. They're very different, but some of them are familiar, like China. But Laurentia was the continent that had the shallow seas to the west that provided the perfect environment for the Burgess Shale to form. Preservation. So, what kind of rocks preserve fossils? Most of the rocks that preserve fossils are ones that have a low energy. So, higher energy things, environments like mountain streams or breaking organisms and crushing them and things like that. But the environments for shale and for limestones are shallow to deep marines, where the energy is so low that when the um, organisms die, their bodies are able to sink to the bottom of the water and be buried and preserved. So Lucy A. Wilson and Nicholas J. Bradford, they performed an experiment to see if the composition of the sediment of the shale would help better or preserve the faunas. So for the experiment, they killed two organisms. One was called the Nereus, the polycate, with like a big worm looking thing, and then the Kragan, which is a crustacean. So it kind of looks like a crawdad or something like that, a small lobster type thing. And so they buried them in four different compositions of sand. And so this one right here. This is the Nereus, and it has the sand types are kaolinite, calcite, quartz, and montmorillonite. So the kaolinite and the montmorillonite, they're a clay mineral. Calcite and quartz are more crystalline, and they did it also over here with the Gragan. And so there's your kaolinite, your calcite, your quartz, and your montmorillonite. So they killed these organisms and they buried them in these sediments and then they waited. They waited for, I think, 4 months. And then they exhumed them to see how it had started to decay. And they noticed that in the kaolinite for both organisms, they were the best preserved. They kept the original body shape. They were able to, basically, they could just pluck it out of the sand and have all the organs and everything there. While the other ones, the sand was too coarse and things. And so, like the Montmorillonite and the quartz, they hardened so fast around the organism that the organism would decay and it would leave a cavity, a space where you can't really see what the organism was or anything like that. And so they came to the conclusion that the composition of the sediment was very key to the preservation of the fossils, and that perhaps that the Burgess Shale was high in maybe a mineral like kaolinite. They have continuing studies to try to figure out what exactly the environment was that this happened, but they know that preservation probably happened and occurred because of the minerals in the sediment. So what happened to Laurentia, this continent that Burgess Shale? Now it's called the North America Craton, as you can see in the image to the left. It makes up a goodly portion of the North American continent. And you might wonder, okay, how did the other parts of the North American continent come to be? And why did the Burgess Shale get pushed up if it was being buried like every so million years? So the answer is the laramide and severogenes. Orogeny is a word that just describes a mountain building event. So about 80 to 50 million years ago, the laramide and severogenes, they came to, and they both came and they kind of smashed into the western side of Laurentia. And because of that force and the smashing, it came together, and as a result of that stress, it pushed up, forming the Rocky Mountains from Canada up here, clear down to northern Mexico. And so because of that, that's how we got those layers of rock pushed up so that we were able to discover them. So it's said that the Burgess Shale is the best place to find Cambrian explosion fauna. And so we're just going to talk about what the Cambrian explosion is for a little bit. The Cambrian explosion happened approximately 541 million years ago. And during this time, in the Ediacaran, which was the time period before that, most of the organisms were single cellular. And so when the Cambrian happened, multicellular bodies began to develop and things like that. And all major body plans that we know of today evolved during this time. You can see that we have chordates. That's what we are as humans. We have a backbone, and then all of our organs are on one side of the backbone. And there's there's echinoderms, so that's like starfish and things like that, or mollusks or arthropods and things like that. The basic body plan for all of the organisms on Earth today came from the Cambrian explosion. And you can see right here is where the Burgess Shale, where it starts to preserve those things, which is pretty cool. So we know that the Cambrian explosion happened, but we don't exactly know why it happened. There's been a lot of varying opinions on why it occurred. Most scientists come down to 3 conclusions about why it occurred. The most accepted ones can fit into 3 categories, like I said: environmental stresses, developmental stresses, and ecological stresses. And so we're going to break each of those sections down to talk about why they would have happened. Environmental stresses. So these are like something in the environment stresses the organism so that they need to adapt or they'll die. So the first one is the availability of nutrients. So during the Cambrian, the oxygen and phosphorus availability increased. Oxygen in the atmosphere and in the waters increased, allowing for bigger organisms to develop and to survive. And phosphorus is a key element in providing necessary and it's vital for DNA and membrane and for bone and teeth formation. So both of those are necessary elements for the development of multicellular organisms that we find in the Cambrian. Glaciation. So the picture over here, that's what's been dubbed as snowball Earth. So before the Cambrian, it's believed that the Earth went into a time of glaciation where the majority of the Earth was covered in ice. And so we believe that as the ice began to melt, it allowed for more places for organisms to dwell. So it opened up ecological niches that they could grow and develop and take care of. And with that melting of the ice, it led to a change in seawater composition. So with the oxygen in the atmosphere being diffused into the water and the fresh water coming from glaciation, the salinity of the water decreased, allowing for organisms to grow and to develop and to create new habitats and environments for them to live. The next one is developmental stresses. This hypothesis focuses on the fact that multicellular organisms developed before the Cambrian explosion, and then when the Cambrian explosion hit, then they derived. So it's like it shows over here, the Ediacaran right here, and the Cambrian, right before the Cambrian, there was this explosion and diversification of body type, but all it did after that was just diversify. And so this suggests that there was an environmental trigger of some sort. There was deep divergence, meaning that the molecular changes in the organisms were deep in their DNA, but it doesn't allow for the fact that there was a lack of bilaterian organisms before the Cambrian explosion occurred. And the shallow divergence relies really heavily upon the fossil record, but it's weakened because it can explain the rapid increase in fossil diversification, disparity, or complexity. Both of these models for environmental triggers, the deep divergence and the shallow divergence, support and help explain that the long-term stability of body plans and the increase in complexity, they can be explained by using the gene regulatory networks found in the fossils. So as they study the genes of the fossils found in the Burgess shell, they're able to figure out, okay, these organisms had these certain characteristics that probably were occurring before the Cambrian explosion occurred. So then they will develop and change as the Cambrian diversifies the organisms. The last one is ecological stresses, and this one becomes a little bit more complicated. It kind of turns into the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg kind of question. The first one is adaptive radiation. So this hypothesis talks about how there was a huge mass extinction at the end of the Ediacaran, opening up a large amount of ecological niches. And so the organisms that were there, they just diversified super quickly to fill those niches and fill the available habitat environments. Another one is predator-prey. This one really goes with the chicken and the egg thing. So one hypothesis to look at this hypothesis is that organisms began to develop harder outer shells or claws or things like this because predators started appearing. And then predators started appearing because organisms were harder to kill is the other way that people have looked at it. So as predation became more widespread, the organisms began to experiment in different body types to protect themselves. So you can see in this image right here that this Cambrian organism is preying on the other Cambrian organism. Another one is limited species interaction. So the species live so far away from each other that they didn't have to evolve and adapt for survival because there was no contact between the two species or contact between multiple species. But as these organisms began to develop and everything, there became to be more and more species, and so more interaction between them. And the final one is the evolution of zooplankton. And this was an impact because it said that it would, when the zooplankton would die, their bodies and the nutrients in their bodies would sink to the floor of the water. And in this picture, you can see it would provide extra nutrients. And so we get these burrowing animals like this and like this that would stir up the dirt and bring more nutrients to the bottom of the water. And that's called roughening of the fitness landscapes. So as these burrowing organisms were messing up with the dirt, nutrients were released, things were buried, and that caused more nutrients in the water, so organisms are able to survive better. So the fossils within the Burgess Shale are amazing because they are evidence for a lot of evolutionary principles, but I focus on two. The first one is descent with modification, and we talked about the beak of the finches in class, and so I'm going to use that as an example. But within the shell, you can see how the organisms would sway from side to side depending on what characteristics were most advantageous for them. You could see how it would change over time as the successful parents had progeny and so forth. You can witness that in the fossil record. And transition fossils, these ones are cool because it shows how those transitions happened, how those descents with modification happened. Transition fossils are when the in-between species have been fossilized, so we can see that process it took. So this picture over here shows lots of adaptations that trilobites have had, depending on which environment they're in. So you can see some have bigger heads, some have larger heads and larger bums, I guess, for lack of a better word. Some have many spikes and things, others are very simple, and others are very, very complex. And so just depending on where they lived and where they adapted to their environment changed their whole body structure, but they're still a trilobite. And we can tell how they traveled by those transition fossils. And we can see how they descended with modification to become new species and things like that. So the Burgess Shale, with everything we've learned from it, there's still so much that's being discovered even today. It's an amazing body of rock and an amazing clue to evolution because it holds those keys. It holds those keys to the past that allow us to see how Earth has changed and evolved over time. And it opens up our eyes to things we never even thought possible. One thing that they want to further study is oxygen-rich preservation. So they know that the oceans and things of the Cambrian were very oxygen rich. And this presents a problem because the organisms need anoxic conditions to be preserved. Oxygen-rich waters and sediments actually catalyze decay in organisms. So, as they're trying to figure out why the oxygen-rich seas of the Cambrian preserved the soft-bodied organisms so well. Next, the interaction between species. They just want to see how, as those species are interacting with each other, if that's the reason why they evolved the way they did, why they adapted to their environment the way they did. Going back to I think it was ecological niches, the ecological stresses, I mean, as those interactions happen, what was actually occurring in those environments. And finally, the organic preservation of organisms. So if this one means that if you have an organism and the chemical compounds that make up that organism, if it leads to higher preservation potential than other organisms. And this is something that's really interesting because the fossil record always has been swayed in the direction of hard parts or things that were um, buried quickly or something like that. They were able to be solidified before decaying. And so this is a big thing that they're focusing on is how all these things work together in order to gain that amazing preservation in the Burgess Shale. Thank you for listening to my presentation on the Burgess Shale. I had a really fun time studying this and seeing how it is an amazing record for evolution. I hope you learned as much as I did.